Chicago's homelessness crisis, an uncontrolled explosion. 2024 has arrived in Chicago with a violent wave of homelessness. This is no longer an underlying issue, but a public disaster pushing the city to the brink. From the cold, hard statistics in reports to the heartbreaking stories of homeless people on the streets, the situation is worsening and spreading. Astonishingly, the number of homeless people in Chicago has surged to 75,400, a 28% increase from the previous year, marking the highest number ever recorded. This crisis is not just a temporary spike, it represents a long-term upward trend, with a 51% increase since 2013 and 39% in just the past 4 years. This explosion has exposed a harsh reality. Chicago's support system has become overwhelmed, no longer able to protect its most vulnerable citizens. The issue is compounded by the fact that nearly 56.3% of the homeless population lacks even temporary shelter. These figures paint a bleak picture of a life filled with hardship for those who are forced to endure the elements on the city's crowded and dangerous streets. Cook County, the epicenter of this homelessness storm, feels the pressure most acutely. Each night, nearly 13,115 people face the grim reality of having no shelter, with 6,685 struggling to survive on the streets or even in their cars. For these individuals, life isn't just a battle to find shelter. It's a race for survival. The rise of chronic homelessness has further worsened the situation. In 2024, over 15,980 people are chronically homeless, representing 21.2% of the total, marking an alarming increase from just 4,158 people in 2018. These individuals face not only the lack of housing, but are also trapped in a cycle of economic and social instability that seems impossible to escape. Adding to this crisis is the rise of the refugee population and undocumented immigrants, with the number of undocumented immigrants in Cook County soaring to approximately 19,700 people in 2023. These newcomers face numerous challenges, from economic instability to limited access to essential services. For many of them, homelessness is not just a risk, but an unavoidable reality. The high cost of living in Chicago, a heavy burden on residents. In 2024, it's not just the growing homelessness crisis that's spreading in Chicago. The skyrocketing cost of living is also weighing heavily on thousands of residents. With the cost of living 24% higher than the state average and 14% above the national average, the city is becoming an increasingly difficult place to live. Housing costs are one of the primary reasons. The median home price in Chicago has skyrocketed to $602,000, far above the national average of $375,000. This has turned the dream of home ownership into an impossibility for many residents. And if you think renting is a solution, the average rent for a 2-bedroom apartment at $2,470 per month is a daunting figure for many. It's not just housing. Other costs also contribute to making life more difficult for Chicagoans each day. Monthly public transportation fares have reached $125, and for drivers, the cost of parking in the city ranges from $250 to $520 per month, a significant burden. Gas prices are also much higher than the national average, making transportation a hefty expense for families. In addition, everyday costs such as food, healthcare, and utilities have also risen higher than in other areas. For example, the average monthly utility bill for a single person is around $198, and for a family, this can climb to $310 per month. These expenses add up, leaving many families with little to save or cope with unexpected costs. Take the case of a family living in Logan Square. Both parents work full-time, but their wages are barely enough to cover basic expenses. With $2,500 for rent, $290 for utilities, and $750 for food, there's not much left for them to save or prepare for emergencies. The high cost of living forces this family to cut back on recreational activities and even delay important medical expenses. The cost of living in Chicago not only burdens families, but also contributes to the growing homelessness crisis. Those who were already struggling to make ends meet in this expensive city now face an increased risk of losing their homes. According to a study, more than 33% of renters in Chicago spend over a third of their income on rent, exceeding the safety threshold and putting them at greater risk of homelessness. With an economy affected by high housing costs, utilities, and taxes, Chicago is becoming a city where financial instability is an integral part of residents' lives. This only widens the gap between those fortunate enough to have homes and those living on the streets. In the midst of an unrelenting crisis, these are the challenges the city must face to protect the safety and quality of life for its residents. Rising poverty, Chicago's economic nightmare. Amid the homelessness crisis, poverty in Chicago is also on the rise, becoming an issue that cannot be ignored. Since 1960, when only about 12% of the population lived in poverty, the situation has drastically changed. Despite the government spending nearly $12 trillion to fight poverty since President Lyndon Johnson launched the War on Poverty in 1964, Chicago is now in a situation no one could have anticipated. In 2024, nearly 20.6% of Chicago's residents are living in poverty, significantly higher than the U.S. rate of 11.5%. Poverty is not just a dry statistic, but a visible reality in the daily lives of hundreds of thousands of residents. Economic inequality in Chicago is said to be among the highest in the United States. The gap between the rich and poor continues to widen, with wages unable to keep up with the ever-increasing cost of living. This leaves many families struggling not only to cover basic expenses, but also trapped in a cycle of poverty with no way out. Poverty is not just a financial burden, but also a catalyst for many other far-reaching consequences, the most notable being homelessness. With the highest homelessness rate in the nation, Chicago is facing the extreme stress of stretched public resources and services. The homeless not only suffer from the lack of shelter, but they are also forced into dire health and safety conditions. Lack of access to health care and safe living conditions has led to higher rates of chronic illness, negatively impacting the health of Chicago's residents. Moreover, poverty contributes to the rise in crime. In areas with high poverty rates, economic desperation drives many into criminal activity, creating a vicious cycle of poverty and violence. As a result, the safety of residents is threatened, and law enforcement agencies face significant challenges in controlling the situation. Imagine a family living on Chicago's South Side, where poverty and crime rates are particularly high. The parents work tirelessly, but cannot earn enough to support their family, while their children face the risk of violence every time they step outside. Meanwhile, access to quality education and health care remains out of reach, further deepening the family's hardships. Rising poverty in Chicago is not just an economic phenomenon, but a deep social issue that undermines the community's structure and negatively affects the entire city's population. Without timely and comprehensive intervention from the government and social organizations, this crisis will continue to drag on and cause even more severe consequences. Chicago's homelessness crisis is not just a housing issue, but also tied to deeper factors like poverty, high living costs, and inequality. Solving this problem will require the combined efforts of the government, the community, and social organizations. With its resilient history, Chicago can overcome this challenge by investing in housing solutions, improving social support, and building a more sustainable future for all its residents.